he pointed to this verse. It's Genesis 32:25. In this story, Jacob, in Hebrew Yaakov, is fleeing from his brother Esau. It's not entirely clear what's going to happen. And then he was crossing his family over the Jabbok River, in Hebrew the Yabok. And then there's this weird phrase, which I'll read out loud. It says, Vayivater Yaakov livado. And Jacob was left all by himself on the other side of the Jabbok River. Vaye'avek ish imo, and a man aveked with him. And this phrase is really odd. We're not entirely sure what it means. It might come from the word dust, so we think it's like someone wrestled him. And this was like the angel of God wrestling Jacob until the morning came, and eventually Jacob would be renamed Israel.
And the connection to dust is when you wrestle someone, you end up rolling around in the dust.
Right. So what this Redditor pointed out is that there's this really odd phrase here of vaye avek, and this root, which Nehemia, you kind of mentioned dusting and wrestling, and I'll make it a nice highlight here so everyone can see it. That word is very odd. It's not a normal word. It doesn't appear often. It's just a very odd thing. So what the reader pointed out was that it's a pun, and it's basically Vayavek Yaakov biyabok, and Jacob, something like Jacob jabbed at the Jabbok, right? And so what you basically have is this pun, this idea that like, oh, we're using special language to kind of mirror the story going on, is something that gets completely lost in the English. So for example, here we have the King James Version. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Right? It's kind of plain. It's not like the Thriller of Manila, or like Hakeem the Dream, something like that. You don't get these kind of puns in the English, but in the Hebrew you get something more like Jacob jabbed at the Jabbok, something like that.
Well, and if nothing else, you can say Yabok there's what we call Midrash Shem, a name derivation here, that Yabok is being tied into the place of wrestling. Right.
There you go.
At the very least. And the example I love of that is the story of Gideon, where Gidon is the verb, or the root of that is the verb in Deuteronomy, where it's used to cut down an Asherah tree. That's the sacred pole of the pagans, of the Canaanites. And what does Gidon do? Is he cuts down the Asherah tree, right? And so it's like woven into the very fabric of the story, these word puns. And here's an example where it's woven, and I didn't even notice this one. So it's woven into the fabric of the story. Certainly Yavek and Yabok there's a word pun there. That's nice, beautiful.
Yeah, and this is actually in Genesis, Bereshit, and what I tried to do for the viewers is bring a lot from Genesis, because many people who start Hebrew start with Genesis. Okay. And the thing is that it's all over this book. So, for example, the name of Adam is also the name of man, like mankind is Adam. Adam is Adam, man. And we read in Genesis 2:7 that God created the man, Vayitzar Adonai Elohim et ha'adam afar min ha'adama. That God created the Adam, the man, dust from the Adama, the earth, right? And so it's a clear pun in Hebrew, that the name man, Adam, comes from the earth, Adama.
So we have these word puns all over, and people who have heard me teach on for years have heard of. I've actually brought that example many, many times. I never brought the Yabok and Yavik example. I never noticed that. It's great. There was a professor actually at your alma mater, Bar-Ilan University, Moshe Garciel, who wrote really a groundbreaking book called, what was it called? It was called Biblical Names. That's what it was called. And he shows many examples. He didn't come up with this idea, but he showed how it was not just in individual word puns and individual verses, but that it was woven into the very fabric of the story.
And the great thing is that when you learn biblical Hebrew, it's all these names don't reveal themselves to you at once. As you learn more and more biblical Hebrew, you start noticing more and more and more. Like, for example, still in Genesis, it took me a while to realize that the name of the first person who was killed, whose life was cut short, is Abel, or Hevel in Hebrew. Right? And Hevel, as we know from the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, it can mean lots of things, but one of the things it means is cut short, like a breath in the wind, right? Like a breath
Or it
that
means
goes away.
emptiness, vanity, emptiness.
There's all these different
Yeah,
things, but that's what happened to Abel. His life was empty and cut off and short,
yeah.
right? So you kind of see these. And when I say that, like, it takes time, it wasn't until last year that I actually heard an idea. Maybe maybe you've heard this.
Yeah.
But so the name Shimshon,
Uh-huh.
right? What's the derivation of Shimshon?
Sun,
Right.
Shemesh.
The Shemesh is the sun, right?
Right.
And so who does he fall for? He falls for Delilah.
Uh-huh.
And Delilah convinces him at night, right?
Hmm.
And what is in the name Delilah?
Lila.
Lila,
Night.
night.
Okay.
So you have
That one.
Shimshon.
That. Okay. That's interesting. What jumps out of that more for me is the geography. He takes place between Sarah and Eshtaol, and what's exactly in the spot where his story takes place? Beit Shemesh, which is a place where people worship the sun originally.
Right, the
Right.
house of the
So
sun.
right, House of the Sun, Temple of the Sun, and here you got a guy named Shimshon, who he's kind of a sketchy character in some ways, right?
Yep.
He's worshiping the true God, but he's like, doing all kinds of things. Like this is our hero who's called actually a savior of Israel, who's going to prostitutes, and he's having trouble with all kinds of women, and so there is some connection, a subtle implication there that maybe he's not put completely in the camp of God. Maybe he's in the camp of sun worship, or maybe the people around him are.
Right.
And Delilah from Lila, that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that. I always took that to be a Philistine name and therefore probably not related to Hebrew, although I guess we don't know for sure what the Philistines spoke. One of the early Philistine inscriptions we have actually is in Hebrew. So what are we going to do about that?
It doesn't matter if we know for sure. We'll never know for sure. But if you know the
Mhm.
Hebrew, you can now look for these types of puns and connections,
Mhm.
especially with names. And like, I'll just give one more example. The verb tzachak, to laugh,
Yeah.
appears 13 times in the Tanakh.
Okay.
11 in them are in Genesis, most
Okay.
having to do with one person.
Isaac.
Isaac, because
Yeah.
Isaac in Hebrew
Yeah.
is Yitzchak, he will laugh. So
Right.
Abraham at that time was Avram, and Sarai, Sarah, they were laughing about this idea of having a kid in old age. And then
Mhm.
even Yitzchak himself makes Rebecca, Rivka laugh, right? So there's all this laughing around this person, Isaac, that if you're reading in the English, you just have no idea that that's part of the text. Okay?
Mhm.
All right, so
So,
let's
so what you're telling me is, let's summarize. The question was, why do you want to teach Hebrew? And you're saying that you can convey to people that there is this a level of reading in Hebrew, a level in the story that's completely missed in translation. And sometimes they try to convey it, but usually it's very difficult to translate a pun.
right.
And so that sometimes they'll use a word that does sound similar. I've seen that, but 98% of the time they can't do it, and so that's lost, and that's a kind of a level of understanding that people can't have unless they see the original.
Exactly. If you ask somebody why did the King James use this word to wrestle with Jacob, right?
Yeah,
There's no reason. It was just a good translation. But
yeah.
when it comes to Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, it's a good chance it was used to kind
Right.
of tie everything together in the
So,
story.
so here I want to bring up something which I've noticed in my own research. I've shared this with people, is that there's these two types of name derivations. I guess Garciel talks about it as well. So there's the name derivations that are explicit, right? It says, and therefore he called her, or therefore
Right.
she was called Chava because she was the mother of all that chayav, all that lives,
Right.
or Em Kol
Exactly.
Chai, all that live. So that's an explicit name derivation. We also have ones that I call implicit, and an example of the implicit you brought. It doesn't say God made Adam out of the Adamah, and therefore he was called Adam. But
Right.
that's implied by the use of the language. And the
Right.
example of Jacob, Vayavik, and he entered into the dust, right? It's the Nepha, which is sometimes has the meaning of to enter into something, into a dual relationship. He entered into the dust with him is related to the word Yabok, and that's an implicit name derivation. Sometimes you have both, which is the ones I love. So why is Esav's descendants called Edom?
Right.
Well, we're told explicitly because he sold his birthright for the red lentil soup. But
Yeah.
then why tell us that when he came out, he was Admoni, he was all red,
It's both.
right? Right. So it's both, and one is explicit, one's implicit. Maybe you could say this is an example of polysemy, meaning that there could be more than one reason for something, more than one truth about why something is something in the Tanakh. In our Western thought, there's 2 + 2 = 4. Well, it's true that 2 + 2 = 4. I guess in spiritual matters, you could say, well, there could be multiple reasons for something, right? Why do we keep the Shabbat according to Exodus and Deuteronomy and the Ten Commandments? One is because God created the world, and he rested on the seventh day, and the other reason is because God took us out of Egypt, and we should have our servants rest just like we wanted to rest. And both are true, right? They're not contradictory. They're both true.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
you yeah.
yeah, all of these can get lost. Not necessarily,
Yeah.
like you pointed out, some they point out, but sometimes if it's not pointed out explicitly, the
Even
English
yeah.
doesn't pick up on it.
Even when it's pointed out, it's completely confusing. You read, he was called such and such, or or it says something, and therefore he was called such and such, and you're like, what on earth?